Hello, Professor McQuire. We are very happy to see you in our project, City as a Classroom.
Thank you for inviting me.
Professor McQuire, in your book, The Media City, you write that the modern city has turned into a media architectural complex. Could you please explain what media architectural complex is and how it differs from the concept of smart city?
If I went back a long time, so I started writing that book about 20 years ago. And at that time, the main way people were thinking about the spatial experience in cities was from urban design and from architecture, that the impact of what we built in material sense would shape our spatial experience. And so that was the primary way of thinking about it. And my argument was that increasingly our spatial experience was also being influenced by media technologies, by different ways of connecting one site to another site, or by screen windows that open up visions to other spaces, by new forms of mobility. So the media city, the idea of the media city or the media architectural complex is an attempt to recognize that it's not a causal relationship. It's not that media becomes more important than architecture, but that the two start to work together in particular ways. They become an assemblage, to use a term that is more common these days. They produce different kinds of feedback systems between them. I have a very broad sense of media, and I talk about that a little bit in the book, why I use the term media rather than, at the time, there was more common terms like information technology or information city. But today, I think it's very clear that the difference between computing, between telecommunications, and between media in a more traditional sense, that those differences have been eroded. And I prefer the term media to cover that broad spectrum. And I was also interested in things like the impact of electric lighting on cities, the way in which when you walk into a city that is got a lot of electric lighting and people's spatial experience changed enormously. So that was part of what I was interested in. So I thought that the terms like information city, they tended to be a little bit too focused on the present and a little bit too focused on computers and not thinking about things like electric lighting or screens in urban spaces or mobile phones, all those kinds of things that I was interested in. So that's why I tended to use the term media city, to move away from that kind of narrow, short-term focus and to get away from a technocentric understanding of the city. The smart city thing is a more recent designation. It's grown out of the same kinds of developments. It's obviously grown out of the capacity to capture a lot of data within cities and about cities, to store that data, to retrieve it very rapidly and cheaply, to process it very cheaply. So we've seen over the last 20 years cities being connected up with network sensors of all kinds, and whether that's pollution sensors or light sensors or things like cameras or mobility sensors. You've seen all kinds of systems, access to buildings, ticketing systems that can produce data, stuff about utilities, power use, can produce data about the users in all kinds of ways now. We also see a lot of information that can be dragged off the internet now that it couldn't be 20 years ago, and particularly off social media. So a lot of behavioural data about opinions, but also about where people are. So mobility information can be dragged in now. And of course, things like mobile phones. Everybody carrying a mobile phone, it gives us access to information, but it also radiates an awful lot of information about what we're doing and particularly where we are. So the smart city is a concept that grows out of all of those things. But you can say a smart city is a particular type of media city, or it's a particular imagination of a media city, but a narrow one. You think of the history of smart city, it's not a concept that came from architects or urban designers. It's a concept that came out of tech companies who are interested in selling enterprise level software. It's a concept that companies like IBM and Samsung and so on, in a way it's almost a trademark concept. And I think this compromised for some time the way in which that was understood. It was very much a top-down managerial approach to the city. So it's a particular imagination of what a media city might be, but not a particularly attractive one, I'd say.
Thank you very much. So my next question, could you please share with us about historical stages of the transformation of the media city and which technologies played a key role?
Well, I mean, I think it depends how far you want to look back, because I would say cities have always been mediatized. They're mediatized by forms of language, they're mediatized by forms of art, by statues, by, you know, all kinds of aspects. You can think of architecture as a particular kind of medium. If you think of Victor Hugo's book that he wrote, Notre Dame de Paris, he famously writes, "This will destroy that." He's talking about literature destroying the communicative function of architecture. That's back in 1831, so it's before photography, you know. So we've always had this sense of the city as communicative, as embodying symbolic forms, and therefore as mediatized in a way. My work's concentrated much more on what I'd call the modern spectrum of media technologies. So beginning with photography as the first technological image, and then extending and thinking about cinema, about television, about digital images. And I think each of those, and they all coexist in the present, but each emerges at a different historical moment, and they condition a different interplay between the city, the way we imagine the city and the way we inhabit it. And that's the part that I suppose really interests me. It's not that they give us representations of the city, but they actually condition the way that we interact in cities. So when I was writing about photography, for instance, I was thinking about the way in which the image changes in the 1830s onwards. And by the 1850s, when they're starting to redesign Paris and they employ a city photographer to document the process. And it's conditioned by the fact that for the first time you can make images plentifully. You don't have to sit there and hand draw them laboriously, you know. As an artist, you might make several hundred images, several hundred paintings through your life. A photographer, even in the 19th century, could make images several hundred per year easily. So it gives you a different sense of what an image is. It becomes less unique, it becomes less self-contained. I talk about it as a serial image. The image starts to become an information flow about the city. And certainly when Charles Marvy was photographing Paris in the 1860s and 1870s, and he's documenting the reconstruction of this medieval city and the making of the great modern boulevards, there is an ideological element to it. It's a form of propaganda. They're wanting to prove that the new city is great, it's really good. With cinema, there's a very different visual logic that comes to play, because obviously it's a logic of montage. And the theorist and the filmmaker that I use in my book to illustrate it is a Ukrainian filmmaker, usually known as Ziga Vertov. And that capacity to reorganize the time and space of the city through montage that he demonstrates in all his films, but particularly in The Man with the Movie Camera, I think is emblematic of the way in which we experience urban space in the beginning of the 20th century. That's the moment when the city becomes electrified. That's the moment when we have new perspectives on the city from high structures. That's the moment when we start to move through the city in new ways, in fast vehicles, in trams, in trains, in automobiles, and so on. They all generate a type of cinematic experience of the city. When we move on to television, we're thinking, well, that corresponds to a very different urban organisation where cities have started to spread, they've started to sprawl. The city centre is now surrounded by suburbs. And so you have a very different articulation between the public life, the public sphere, and the domestic sphere, the home. And television becomes really pivotal in that. It becomes like a fulcrum connecting people's home to the wider world, to the public domain, but also to the commercial domain and the political domain. It becomes that single window through which you're getting all these messages about politics, about news, models of how you should behave, the consumer lifestyle that is being created in that time. So that's a very particular kind of moment. And I think the more recent one, and what I started to write about in The Media City, and I've written more about more recently in terms of Geomedia. Media starts to move out of specific sites such as the home. You don't have to be at home to be connected to media the way we did in the 1970s or 80s. You also don't have to be in specific production places in order to create media. When you're carrying something like this, you're carrying a studio in your pocket. So this changes a lot of things. And so in Geomedia, I talk about the way in which digital media starts to become ubiquitous, which is always a relative term, but much more ubiquitous than it had been. It starts to become place aware. So we're seeing digital media being sensitive to the location in which it's capturing information and sensitive to the way in which it distributes information. All information now is geotagged. That's one of the fundamental organizing principles around it. And the other aspect of it is you start to see these feedback systems that I was talking about become more distributed, that is more dispersed, less centralized, and more rapid. So we have this idea of real-time communication from many to many with digital networks. And I think that is a very different threshold. That's the one we're living through now, where we're getting a very different sense of a media event. It's no longer about the events happening out there and the news organization goes out and films it the way Vertov might have done in the 1920s. Now people are at the event, they have their mobile phones, they're communicating with each other, they're making photographs and video, they're self-reporting. This is all happening in real time, and it can reshape how the event is taking place. And you see this in all kinds of forms, whether it's a rock concert or a urban light festival or a political protest. The way in which the crowd starts to take on a different dynamic because of the communication technology. So these are all quite different thresholds of the media city. We still have archives, we still experience media in domestic spaces like the home, but they exist as particular nodes now in a much more generally mediated atmosphere.
Thank you. Professor McQuire, is it possible to say that the development of photography, film, and media are tools for creating virtual reality or hyperreality, the concept described by Jean Baudrillard?
Well, I mean, there's different ways of thinking about this, because often when people think of hyperreality, they think of something like it's false. You know, like people talk about fake news now, that it's some kind of, you know, as if there's a deeper reality under it. That's not really what Baudrillard was talking about. He's talking about that sense in which, you know, you think of his book Simulations, which was written a long time ago now, but he says, you know, what is happening in the, when's he writing that, the late 1970s, 1980s? What is happening is that the image starts to precede the event. The image comes first. I think this is a really interesting understanding of our situation. One thing that has happened with technological images, images are no longer scarce. You know, for a long time in history, images were rare. It was rare to have an image of yourself. You had to be rich and powerful to have an image of yourself. Since the industrialization of photography in around the 1880s, images are no longer scarce. So images become surplus. We're swimming in images all the time. And this is the condition that Baudrillard is talking about, where because there's so many images, they start to shape our imagination. So we all have this experience. We go somewhere and we've seen a picture of it before. It's not surprising to us. Well, in many ways, it is still surprising to us. But so often we've gone somewhere, we've seen an image of it. You travel to America, which is obviously somewhere that fascinated Baudrillard, and you've seen it in so many films. You've seen all of these different situations. Even more than that, we reshape our lives around the possibility of making an image. Yeah. And you can see that on all kinds of different levels. You can see it on the political level. If someone gives a speech, they set up with a nice background. They organize in their speech that they're going to say certain sentences a number of times to make sure that the editor will just choose that 10 seconds for the night. They're thinking in advance, what's this going to look like as an image or as a video caption? Or, you know, if someone has a wedding, what do? They organise how they're going to be in a photograph for later. So there's all kinds of ways in which I think what Baudrillard is talking about is very perceptive. one of the things he wrote about was the idea of, he talks about the Georges-Louis Bourget's story about the map, yeah? The idea of a map that was one-to-one scale with the world. And of course, this is an impossible ideal, you can't make, but in Bourget's story, of course, it becomes real, but it's impossible to construct. And the people who are constructing this map, they forget what they're doing. And eventually, the civilization wanders on. And he concludes by saying they're now living in the ruins of the map. Like the map has taken over the world. I think that's a kind of fascinating allegory when we start to think about contemporary digital maps. You think about something like Google, its mapping system, which is so detailed and so global. And one aspect of it has been the Street View system, where they drive in cities all around the world and they say, we're going to photograph every street in every city around the world. And they've proceeded to do it in, 140 countries so far, maybe a bit more than that. That is something that Baudrillard probably wouldn't have thought about, but it's totally within that logic, of constructing such a detailed map of the world. Now, when we want to go somewhere, we can refer to Street View and say, well, this is what this street looks like, or this is what this house looked like, at least at a certain moment. The current logic of the map is to turn it into a real-time entity, that it can respond. It can tell you about things like, okay, you're driving this way, but the traffic congestion's bad there, or they're doing some construction there, you shouldn't go that way, or you should go this way because there's something interesting for you to see. That is the level of detail, but also the different temporality of the map. That's a kind of hyperreality of itself. And I think probably the best way to think about it is that intertwining of mediation of media and cities that we were talking about earlier. That is a state of hyperreality.
Thank you. You write about the fact that the media affects our perception of space and time. Please tell us about it.
Well, that's a big question.
Yes, and very interesting.
I think you could argue that media, in a broad sense, are constitutive of space and time. You need to have the capacity to symbolize in order to have a sense of sequence, in order to have a sense of projection into the future and imagination of the past. Despite this, I think it's rarely been a central focus of inquiry to understand the relation between media and space and time. It's only probably the last 50 years that people have thought about it in that way. There was a Canadian economic historian called Harold Innes, and he wrote a couple of books at the end of his career where he talked about media in terms of space bias and time bias. And by that, he doesn't mean bias like unfairness. He means that it's weighted towards space or it's weighted towards time. His examples were things like clay tablets and stone inscription. And for him, they'd be time-biased media because they're slow to make, but incredibly durable, but obviously hard to move, And he said time-biased media tended to favour societies that were relatively small in scale, that were highly centralised, like a religious hierarchy or religious tradition, something like that. And he contrasted that with when people developed paper, whether it was the Chinese or the Egyptians, I don't mind which, they probably both did it independently. But paper's a very different type of medium because he says it's space bias. And paper's obviously really fragile compared to stone or clay tablets, but it's light. You can transport it. And he said once you had paper as a medium, you could develop much more extensive society. So you could develop empire. You could develop bureaucracy because you can keep records in a different way, which is, of course, what the Chinese did. So that's a very different understanding of media. It was very influential on Marshall McLuhan, who adapts the idea to television and then starts to talk about television as a global village. And the understanding that people have at that time is largely that media is what we use to overcome the limitations of space and time. So it helps us to remember the past. It helps us to bridge distance, and particularly something like television with its instantaneous transmission. It helps to link up disparate spaces or disparate audiences. The same idea carries through into the network era, but I think we've seen a real change in the last 20 years, as I was describing a minute ago. When media leaves home, when media starts to become embedded in cities around, you know, in a more ubiquitous way, when media becomes pervasive, its relationship to space and time changes somewhat. So traditionally, we've talked mostly about media's capacity to displace people. And you'll see an awful lot of social theory where people will talk about media being destructive of place. Media has an impact on architecture that's largely negative, or media has an impact on cities that's largely negative. I think what we need to also think about is the way in which, particularly in the last decade with digital media, with location-based media, with media that is place-sensitive, the media has become much more constitutive of place. It's embedded in place. It's a place-making technology. And they're two quite different trajectories. And so that's this strange moment we occupy in the present, where we can see, as we're talking now on Zoom, we're using media to bridge space and time, to talk from Ukraine. You're in Odessa, yeah?
Yes.
So to Melbourne, we can talk almost naturally, not quite the same as being in the same room, but like that. But we also need to think about the way in which media is increasingly part of making places. So the way in which people annotate places now, connecting particular sets of information to particular sites, which you can pick up using your mobile devices. Very common experience now. So I don't think we can talk about media the way that Innes did, or the way that McLuhan did, where they thought place would no longer matter so much, because place still matters an awful lot. But our sense of place is also very different from what it would have been 40 or 50 years ago, because we constantly have this sense that, yes, we're in a particular situation, but it can always be punctured or interrupted by a connection to another situation. And it's this possibility for, how would you put it, that collision between situations, the interplay of them, or the interface between them, that becomes definitive of our situation now.
Thank you very much. Professor McQuire, how do you think, why large cities have turned into some magnets and continue to grow? If you can contact anywhere in the world, even a small village, by means of internet and media?
Okay, I mean, I guess the short answer is economics. I think that the growth of cities is not necessarily driven by so much a plan as it's an effect of a particular economic system where jobs aggregate in cities. I think a longer answer, and that would be a too simple answer, although it's certainly part of the picture, but people enjoy cities. Maybe not up to the scale where they're in the tens of millions, but they enjoy cities because of the capacity to interact with all kinds of different people. So there's a sociability element to it. And we've seen that, you know, the way in which when you're lit, you know, George Simmel writes about this at the beginning of the 20th century. He says, the difference between the big city and the small town or the village is that with the big city, you're living with strangers, or it's a different type of stranger. In the village, the stranger comes and then they leave, or if they stay, you get to know who they are. They don't remain a stranger. But in the city, you're living among strangers all the time. And this is our condition. Doesn't mean we don't know people, but most of the people around us, we don't know who they are. That condition of living among strangers unleashes enormous energy, because it challenges us, it challenges our way of thinking, it challenges what we take for granted. And so we see cities that have large migrant populations, like Paris in the 19th century or New York at the beginning of the 20th century, that there's enormous cultural innovation that comes out of those cities. So I think that's part of it, that cities that have a certain level of scale, they're better economic markets, there's more buyers and sellers there, there's more diversity. They have a sociability element to it. And we've also more recently started thinking about urban density as attractive because of sustainability reasons. We don't want cities to become too big. We need them to be more concentrated because of the use of resources if we're having a city that sprawls like a lot of Australian cities too. This is a really interesting moment for that now in the moment of the pandemic, because obviously the density of a city, which is important for its sociability, it's important for its economic life, it's important for its sustainability, but that's also the conditions under which the virus flourishes. So we have to think about how we're going to balance out urban density with safety in the face of pandemic, and whether we get a vaccine for COVID-19, hopefully we will in the next couple of years, but it's very unlikely that this is the last pandemic we're going to see. So we've set up an interesting architecture now where we have cities, mega cities, some with tens of millions of people, particularly in parts of Asia and Africa. We've got a global network of airlines, most of which are not flying at the present time. But we've set up conditions for incubating and disseminating viruses very effectively. And we're going to have to think about how we do this. Half the world's population, more than half the world's population now live in cities. That was the threshold we crossed about 10 years ago. That means that you've got half the world's population living on about 2% of the world's landmass. So density is necessary. We like it. We like crowds. We're sociable. They produce good markets. But it's also a challenge. Yeah. Yes. The other part of the question you asked is, well, we can connect anywhere from the internet and so you can work anywhere. I guess people have thought that telecommuting, as they used to call it, or teleworking from the 1970s, they had this idea that, well, no one will live in cities because it doesn't matter. You go and live down the beach or up on a mountain or whatever. That's only true of certain types of jobs, and we've seen this in the pandemic. Not everybody can stay at home and work. Academics can, but a lot of jobs you can't do from home. There's manual labour involved. The other part of it is people don't necessarily want to live in isolation. They like the social element. We like to be part of crowds, as long as they're not necessarily too big. So I think these are real challenges for cities. How are we going to manage urban density in the future?
Yes, thank you. Modern city equipped with many cameras that follow us. Applications on our phones track our geolocation. How does the development of a media city affect human security, and did modern people lose their personal space and private lives? What do you think?
Yes. Look, again, there's a lot of different aspects of this. You know, you can see it with the current response to the COVID-19 pandemic, that in a lot of countries, they've developed either tracking and tracing apps for phones or monitoring apps or various forms of digital health passport. And that's an interesting development. We might come back to that. But I mean, there's a long history of using cameras for surveillance. You know, you go back to 1871 and the Paris Commune, the communards posed on the barricades for photographs. And then later on, the police used those photographs to track people down and arrest them. You know, so there's always been that ambivalence that once you make an image of something, it can be used by different people. But of course, what we've seen more recently is the embedding of video cameras into urban spaces, and particularly the networking of these video cameras. So, you know, you go back, you know, video cameras start to emerge as single installations in the 1950s and 60s. And they really expand in some cities like London in the 70s and 80s because of the IRA bombings. And they start to, you know, there's suddenly lots of them around. But the real change happens in the 90s when you can network these cameras together. So they're no longer like separate islands, but you can actually start to get information flows from all these different places. And now it'd be very common in a lot of cities around the world to have tens of thousands of cameras, and they're a mix of private cameras, you know, shopping centres, shops, people's houses, and also traffic cameras, and then just public safety cameras. You know, a city like Moscow has 150, 170,000 cameras in it. So it's an issue for us to think about how are we going to deal with this? I think there's all kinds of issues that are raised here about who's capturing the information, why they're capturing the information, what they're doing with it, how long they're storing it. There's a particular issue that is raised now by using face recognition software with video cameras. Face recognition software is increasingly being deployed by cities as a way of policing public space. There's problems with face recognition software, partly because it's prone to error. And this is something that's quite well known. You might have seen in the news in the last few weeks a whole lot of US tech companies, including IBM, Amazon, one other, Microsoft, all pulled out of using, they've put a moratorium on use of face recognition technology at present because in the context of the Black Lives Matters protest, it's well known that face recognition technology is both error prone in relation to female faces compared to male faces, dark skinned faces compared to light skinned faces, the error rates are much higher, but also that it's been deployed in ways that tend to confirm bias. So over policed sectors of the population become more vulnerable in that context. I think there's a whole lot of other issues that are arising beyond that particular moment. We're starting to see private companies advertise things like, you know, theft prevention face recognition. Again, drawing from the US. This was an example I saw a few months ago. I don't know whether it would actually work, but what they're offering is a system that would scan your face as you're approaching the door of a shop. It would be linked to a database of known offenders. Now, I don't know how they define known offenders, whether they have access to criminal records or whether they're simply making predictions about people based on profiling. And then it would refuse entry to the shop. You know, so you're seeing there, it's no longer a retrospective system, but it's both a predictive system and it's one that's intervening in granting access to urban space. I think this is a really problematic development if those kinds of developments are put forward. I was mentioning the response to the COVID-19 pandemic, and I know in China in particular, they're using what they're calling digital health passports as a way of opening up cities after the pandemic. So people have to get a QR code on an app, and then they have to scan it so they can get access if they want to use the subway or they want to enter a department store, they want to leave the city and enter another city, or they want to enter a, you know, an apartment complex or something like that. This is a very problematic development, and at the minute it's being used with QR codes, but you could easily see the way in which it could be used in conjunction with face recognition technology, again, which is being rolled out in China. So these biometric markers start to become very widespread. Another city that is using similar kinds of biometric markers to control the population in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic is Moscow. And again, there's been real concerns about error rates, about the problems with the data that's being gathered and stored. And we can see examples where they're using the same kind of technology at political protests to identify protesters and to intimidate people. So all of these developments, I think, need a lot more debate about the conditions under, you know, if you've got a pandemic, it might make sense to be using some tracing technology so that you can monitor the contacts that someone's made over the last 5 days. But you need to set really strong conditions over how long that data is kept and who can access it and for what purposes. And the concerns I have in relation to, say, what's happening in China, what's happening in Russia and in Moscow is that those conditions are not there. I know that Russia has recently passed a new data law where they're at the federal level able to assemble the data gathered from a whole lot of separate data sources. This is a real concern because it means that once anonymized sources might become you can reverse anonymization quite easily when you start to aggregate multiple data sources. So I think having cameras in place is one problem that we've all been dealing with for 20 or 30 years now. Coupling cameras to face recognition systems and also to actuators, such as, it prevents you gaining access to a train station or to an apartment complex or something like that. That's taking it to a whole different kind of level. It makes the face recognition system, the surveillance system, operational at a new level. So I think it's something that many of us are very concerned about at present. We've seen in the past the way in which pandemics change urban design and change the way in which urban organisation takes place. Michel Foucault wrote widely about this, the way in which the plague changed. It became the beginning of the modern disciplinary form in the 17th century, and it then unfolded over the next 200 years. Because plague was really different to leprosy. With leprosy, it spread slowly. You could take individuals and you put them on an island somewhere or something like that in the leper colony, and you could deal with it that way. But plague spread rapidly. It hit the whole population. So you had to start to organise the city like a grid. You had to inspect separate houses. You had to quarantine individual households and all of those things. What we're doing now is similar, but we're doing it digitally, with digital monitoring devices, with digital health passports and the like. And it would be very sad to look back in 10 or 20 years and say, actually, 2020 and the COVID-19 epidemic was the time in which we installed this digital monitoring system, and that's the legacy that we have with it, and that's what we need. So we need to be very cautious about how we're doing that. Unfortunately, I don't see that level of caution being enacted.
Thank you very much. And the last question, what do you think the city of the future will look like and how it will affect a person?
Well, I know what I'd like to see it look like, but look, I think that there's huge issues that we're at tipping points for. One is sustainability, because cities aren't sustainable now. Another is this issue of security and surveillance that we're talking about, and so I think it's probably inevitable to some extent that cities will become much more highly instrumented. So a really important issue here is not necessarily what they look like, but what the back-end system does. And that's an issue around data control and data ethics. And this is where we need a lot more awareness from the population about what data is being gathered from things like mobile phones or public Wi-Fi systems or internet systems or home automation systems, smart homes, all of those kinds of devices are data gathering devices. I think there needs to be a lot more thinking, but also development of ethical principles around data use. There were some signs over the last couple of years that things like the Cambridge Analytica scandal involving Facebook data, and also the enactment of the GDPR in Europe was making, the whole debate around data was starting to change and people were becoming more aware of it and more concerned about it. Hopefully the pandemic won't mean that that momentum is lost, because it's both governments on the one hand that like this data, they can use it as a control mechanism, but it's also companies on the other hand. The biggest, most valuable companies in the world are using data as their business model. And that's going to be very difficult to roll back, but I think that's what's involved, that we need to put limits around how companies are able to gather data from us. I mean, it was very instructive that in the height of the pandemic, Apple and Google got together and they rolled out these mobility maps, because they make the operating systems from practically all the mobile phones in the world. So they know where everybody is, and they could show you data for hundreds of cities. I mean, they released it at a population level, so it wasn't showing individuals, but I think that that's very concerning as a moment, that two large privately organised profit-based companies have access to this scale of data about people in cities all around the world, possibly bar China. So I think that's one issue that we need to deal with. The other issue I was mentioning before was the issue of density. and how we'll deal with urban density into the future. I think one thing that the pandemic has made clear is that public space is enormously important in cities for our well-being, for our exercise, for our mental health, and that public space in cities is distributed very unequally. So at a moment where people were really locked down, where they couldn't take a train or a tram or drive somewhere to a public space, they realised how important it is to have public space within walking distance. That's something cities need to think about much more seriously. I think in design terms, you know, if you think the history of modern architecture, it was heavily shaped by disease and by hygiene. The aesthetic that was developed by architects such as Corbusier in the early 20th century was, you know, it was about the TB sanitarium, the tuberculosis sanitarium, you know, the white walls, the outdoor terraces, the big windows, the enthusiasm for exercise, for fresh air and so on. That was very much, I mean, there were other issues with it, but it was very much a hygiene motivated aesthetic. So it will be interesting to see in the future what a hygiene motivated aesthetic for cities might look like when we're saying, actually, we can't crowd people together in the same way. This is going to be really challenging for particular parts of the city, such as airports, train stations, but also universities. How do we deal with the lecture theatre or the tutorial room or all of those kinds of things? So I think there are real challenges for designers, and hopefully people will rise to them creatively and think about balancing those issues to do with sociability, to do with sustainability, and to do with managing the surveillance aspect of digital technology. Because digital technology is essential to us. I mean, that's also a lesson from the pandemic. We rely on it. We're not going to get rid of it. We can't turn it off. What we need now is systems that are actually serving us rather than serving the companies. Yeah.
Yes. Professor McQuire, thank you very much for your time, for this exciting conversation.
Okay, fantastic. Well, thank you for your time and thank you for your questions.